The Bobby O Show.
Welcome to the Bobby O Show. My name is Bob Potsner. It's my first day back from an extended trip to Italy, which included a destination wedding for my nephew. And as it relates to this show, I met 3 or 4 different people who are going to be guests down the road in the future. So Bobby O, even when he's away, is always thinking about the next guest for the Bobby O Show. And speaking of guests, I have someone who's been on my show several occasions on several different topics, Rick Lawrence. Rick Lawrence is knowledgeable in many different areas. We've done shows in the past about COVID. We hope we don't need to do any more shows about COVID. We also did a show about AI. And today, Rick Lawrence will be my guest to give me and you an update on what AI is. The show he and I did was about a year ago on AI, and there have been tremendous developments that he'll talk about the AI and ChatGPT. So, Rick, welcome aboard again.
Hi, Bob. As a small point of history, we did 6 shows on COVID, believe it or not. So as always, I'm honored to be back.
And Rick, you know that you are the second most frequent guest on my show to Michelle Phillips, who's been on about a dozen times. So you've got to sort of catch up to where she is if you want to be the number one guest.
Okay, it's a challenge.
Rick, just for a little background for the audience, just give us a quick little background as to what you do, and how it relates to the AI that you're going to talk about.
Yeah, so let me go all the way back and kind of just touch on several things throughout my career that have, sort of prepared me for this whole discussion around AI. So I was an undergrad at Stanford, and this was back in the 70s. And there was a guy named John McCarthy, who's a famous name in computer science and artificial intelligence. By the genealogy today, he's probably the great-great-great-grandfather of AI. At any rate, in the undergrad library at Stanford, believe it or not, there was this ancient teletype that nobody, under the age of 70 perhaps has ever seen. And believe it or not, this was the first chat system, an AI system, and it was almost amusing as how bad it was. So I used to entertain myself at all-nighters at the library by going in and asking it questions like, does the sun rise in the east or the west? And typically getting some bizarre answer. So I went on and got a PhD in nuclear engineering and, did nuclear science for a while, and then ended up going to IBM Research, where I got involved in, computational physics and computer science, and really ultimately in what's called machine learning, which is a principal discipline under AI. And, we're doing a lot of things sort of using big computers to solve problems involving big data, not unlike what AI is doing now. And then, so at the end of my time at IBM, which was 8 years ago, I was overseeing all machine learning and decision analytics at IBM Research in Yorktown Heights. So I left IBM and actually spent 3 years running a quant finance startup in the city, again, based on machine learning right up to the pandemic. And we were funded by some people in Silicon Valley. We lost our funding at the pandemic. So, of course, COVID hit. As a data scientist, I was always intrigued in some of the, data-driven discussions or lack thereof around COVID. So I just started downloading data and doing some analysis and, served on the Ridgefield Task Force. And fortunately, as you point out, hopefully we have done our last show on COVID. And then I started thinking about AI and started giving talks on it. So that's kind of what's brought us here. So let me go back to you, Bob.
Yeah, you mentioned the phrase machine learning. What did you mean by machine learning?
Yeah, so machine learning is a discipline that basically uses algorithms to learn from increased volumes of data. So basically, the more training data this algorithm sees, the more it learns to do a specific task. For example, predicting the number of sales that will be next month, or predicting how many people will click on a link on a website, and so forth. So I say that it's one of the underlying disciplines in AI, because so much, of course, of AI involves learning from data. We can talk about that more, and using it not only to do predictions, but as we found out most recently, to actually generate new content, hence the term generative AI.
When you use the word algorithms, what do you mean by algorithms in this context?
Yeah, so an algorithm, in the case of generative AI, is a massive model that's based on something called a neural network. A neural network has been around for decades. It was originated back in the 1980s, basically as sort of a computational instantiation of how the human brain works. And back in the 90s and even early 2000, these were used for fairly small problems, but computationally, they just couldn't be analyzed. So think of an algorithm as something that takes an input, like, for example, a query to ChatGPT that we'll talk about, and then transforms it to an output, namely the text or the image or whatever that's generated by this generative AI.
And
It's also about just a sort of a simple definition of AI, since we're talking about that. So what is AI? I mean, the simplest definition of AI is sort of it's the theory and development of computer systems that are able to solve tasks that normally require human intelligence. Now, what is generative AI? Well, generative AI is layered on top of AI. And instead of the AI system just learning to sort of classify text or classify images, that is, say this image is a dog versus a cat, which is, by the way, kind of where we were maybe a decade and a half ago in this business, generative AI will now produce new text, new images, new audio, new videos, and for that matter, new computer code that, by the way, in many cases, is good, no matter in across those domains, as what humans can generate. So that's where we are now in generative AI, and the instance that we've been using ChatGPT is probably the best known instantiation of generative AI. Other companies or other capabilities as well, I should mention, but we'll be focusing on ChatGPT here.
I'm not sure if this is a viable question or not, but are there certain types of computer chips that are particularly relevant or necessary if you're doing the AI, or is it that irrelevant to the AI?
Oh, absolutely. That is completely relevant. A company called NVIDIA is
Spell
the
that, please.
dominant,
Spell it.
NVIDIA, NVIDIA, which for a little while had the largest market capitalization of any publicly traded company in the world. NVIDIA has manufactured these chips since long before people were sort of versed in hearing a lot about generative AI. As a small point, by the way, these are actually manufactured by a semiconductor company in Taiwan. So hence you can see there's going to be challenges here in global supply chain as we saw in the pandemic. But these chips are absolutely central to these algorithms. These algorithms cannot be trained and they cannot execute these queries that we see every day without access to massive numbers of these chips.
Do we produce any of these special chips in the United States?
That's a good question. Dominantly, NVIDIA uses, in fact, maybe solely uses the company in Taiwan. Now, and to get off on a very slight political observation, there was the CHIPS Act, the Science Act from the Biden administration, which provided government funding for companies to move chip manufacturing back in the United States. Because as we saw, one of the reasons why we couldn't buy new cars during the pandemic was because of the shortage of all the chips that go into, which are different, by the way, than those that are used in AI, but the chips that go into cars. So needless to say, it's a good strategic initiative for the United States to move this manufacturing back to the U.S. so we will have tighter control in the future over this.
I asked the question not to get into politics for this particular show, although I'm not afraid to do that in any show. When I was in the Board of Education in Ridgefield several years ago, we had a superintendent of schools named Ralph Wallace, and he used to say there's a political in a capital P and a political in a small p. And the capital P would be you're in an election, you're running for candidates, whatever. And small p would be more like no matter what you're doing there may be some political implications. And as you were answering my question, I was thinking about the discussions going on politically involving China and Taiwan, which has been a fight since World War II or before, whatever the time frame is. But in thinking about this, the security of the United States, for example, who controls the chips might be more important than who controls the oil, for example, or as important. Any comments about that?
What's interesting is NVIDIA, I believe, was providing chips to the Chinese, but as I understand, they were dialed back in their performance, which was an interesting way of approaching the problem. But there is no doubt that there are several critical resources that are involved in this. One is, as you just brought up, is the chips. The other is the massive amount of power, electricity, that it takes to run the computers that use these chips to train these models. As a small example, you may have read in the news yesterday, believe it or not, you may recall from my former career in nuclear engineering, there was a nuclear power plant called 3 Mile Island that in March of 1979 had a significant accident. It shut down. It's been shut down since then. Microsoft has just entered into agreement that would reopen 3 Mile Island and sell all of the power, which, by the way, is about 810 megawatt electric, which is a significant power plant, all of that power to Microsoft for one reason, and that is to power all of their servers that train and utilize these AI models. So that just gives you sort of there's not only the front on in terms of the chips, there's a front in terms of the electrical capacity. These models, by the way, right now consume about 1% to 2% of electricity in the U.S. and Europe, and by the end of the decade, it's estimated they're going to go to 3 to 4%. 3 to 4%, all electricity generated.
I never had even thought about until just this question I asked you about the impact on the electricity needs to do, and I presume the power is needed both for the preparing the chips and also the work that's being done by the chips in the AI process. And so that is a significant issue of power, and that ties into what source of power do we use in our country and other countries to produce the electricity needed, whether it's solar, wind, and fossil fuel, whatever. A topic we won't get into today, but certainly, Rick, a topic to get into perhaps in another show that we will do, which will get you up to the lead perhaps someday. The number of guest appearances on the Bobby O Show. Please tell me the distinction between or the relationship between AI and Chat GPT. That's G as in George, P as in Peter, and T as in Tom. How are those two connected, if at all?
Well, maybe the first useful thing to do is we hear GPT a lot. What does it stand for? It stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. Generative because it generates content. Pre-trained because, as I said, it's a massive model that is trained against massive amounts of data. And transformed because it takes a query and transforms it to an output, content, and so forth. So ChatGPT is developed and maintained by a company called OpenAI, and OpenAI is one of a number of companies that are focused on generative AI. OpenAI has a significant investment from Microsoft, so they often partner. So think of ChatGPT as maybe the most publicly known instantiation of generative AI, again, courtesy of the OpenAI company.
It's interesting to me that how people are gradually getting used to both AI and Chat GPT, and there are other entities besides the Chat GPT process. But I was at a friend's, visiting a friend. My wife and I were visiting a friend in North Carolina a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and we were talking about divorce. I do a lot of divorce work in my legal practice. And I was discussing a premarital agreement, which is an agreement some people sign in appropriate settings to determine if you get divorced or something, or if death may happen, whatever. It's not a will, but there's things mostly for a divorce. And my friend said to me, and he's a lawyer, he said, "Why don't you give me the 7 or 8 key components of what a good premarital agreement would contain," knowing, of course, that every state has different laws on divorces, etc. So I gave him 7 or 8 key components. And I will tell you, I was shocked that the document, although not drafted like I would draft it or like a good lawyer would draft, was about 55 to 60% on point. and it made me realize the implications. I'm sure since that time, you're finding more and more ability for these documents to be created, and any document, whether it be an accountant or whatever. So just tell me, please, Rick, essentially how it is that AI and Chat GPT work to get to an end.
So what I found in ChatGPT is that, and particularly, well, let's tell you what, Bob, let me just go back and talk a little bit about its evolve, because that's kind of addressing that question.
Sure.
So it's hard to believe it was in November 2022, I mean, almost 2 years, that OpenAI announced ChatGPT. It was version 3.5 at the time. And I think I gave my first talk on this in June of 2023, so 6 or 7 months later. And by that time, a couple of things were very clear about ChatGPT. Number one is it had captured public's imagination. I think lots of people were talking about it. But like a lot of things that are sort of shiny objects among the public, unlike that, in many cases, ChatGPT was also viewed by AI experts as probably the most significant advancement in AI in our history. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. So there was an enormous amount of hype about it in the summer of 2023. And then, like a lot of new technology introductions, all of a sudden, there was a lot of issues about, misinformation, errors, and so forth. And the balance, and as we closed out 2023, I mean, there were a couple other sort of dominant discussions, which if we have time, we could touch on here. Number one is, how should this be regulated? I think it's almost uniformly agreed that it should be. And if so, how should it be regulated? A ton of intellectual property issues, as you know. New York Times sued OpenAI over use of their copyrighted content. Lots of questions about, well, how do we use this in schools? And, early on, in fact, when it was first released, New York Public Schools actually banned the use of ChatGPT on the network. But then, of course, schools quickly realized that they had to, aspire to have students, get used to interacting with AI while at the same time, retaining critical thinking, problem-solving skills, and so forth. And finally, I think early on in the discussion, there was actually, because ChatGPT was so successful, there was discussion, well, will this be the end of humanity? And what I've seen is I've seen that dial back as well. I think we're starting to realize the reality is still that there's no threat to humanity near term, but longer term, again, we're going to need, very careful, regulatory oversight, as well as, ethical, guardrails on AI to make sure that it retains, the enormous value that it has to society.
Sure.
Without being
and that's a very important factor you made about regulation, because we have certain constraints on newspapers. There's a case called New York Times versus Sullivan about the rights of privacy, et cetera, like that. And if we don't get on top of this issue of ChatGPT and other social media, if we don't deal with it now, we'll have more problems in the future. Rick, you have some slides that you might want to refer to when I asked you the question about how one might use AI or ChatGPT. Would you like to refer to any of those slides and sort of give an example of the kinds of questions that people might ask in use of AI and see what happens?
Yeah, great idea, Bob. So Kenny, the slide one, please. Okay, so this is an example of the output, two different queries. What I'm not showing here is the full interface because it's a little bit tedious for this forum. Basically, ChatGPT, by the way, if you want to get access to it, all you need to do is Google it. It'll take you there, and you can start using it immediately. The interface is not unlike Google. You type in a query, and it gives you back a response. So what I'm showing here is two different queries. And I asked for, the first query is write a 1,000-word essay on critical race theory from a conservative viewpoint. So the first thing I'll say is that I got back a whole lot more than 1,000 words from ChatGPT. And what I've done is I've just summarized its conclusion. And then down below that, you see exactly the same query, but I've asked it to come back from a liberal viewpoint. So why did I do this? Well, as you know, critical race theory is, been in the news in the last several years. So real quickly, what critical race theory is, it's a theory, goes back to, roughly 1980. It argues that racism is not solely due to individual prejudice or bias, but in fact is systemic in nature. That is, if you like, it's embedded in our institutions. It's embedded in our policies, it's embedded in our judicial system, which, by the way, is why all of our alma maters, that is, Bob, Stanford, Yale, and Duke law schools, all have courses on critical race theory. So, Ken, if we could go back to that slide with that background, it's since it's even been discussed in the presidential campaign as to how various candidates would react to this. So here, and let me just highlight, this is the text that came directly from ChatGPT. And I'll real quickly read in case people can't see it. Just the back end of it. While conservatives acknowledge that racism and racial inequality have been significant issues in American history, they argued that critical race theory's focus on systemic racism and group identity risks undermining the progress that has been made towards creating a more just and equal society. Now, I think that's a pretty powerful statement. If I then go down below to the liberal viewpoint, it comes back.
Before you do that, Rick, before you go to the liberal viewpoint, this is one concern I have with the AI and even the Google searches, and that is, if I want to find legal precedent for some case I'm working on, and I have an assistant or a legal assistant or a junior partner research something for me, if they find a case called Smith versus Jones and Sally versus Susie on any topic, I can read the case and know what the source is, and sometimes there might be a different interpretation. I once had a case where the location of a comma in a certain spot or the omission of the comma literally was a matter of $600,000. And if it weren't for my client and me reading the document over 6 or 7 times and thinking about it, we would not have caught the distinction, and the case settled for a lot more money because of that. And so when you have what you put in the screen there, it didn't show Smith versus Jones or Sally versus Susie, and you're relying upon what happens in the search. And there's another expression I use, garbage in, garbage out. And I'm not saying this is garbage, but without having a way to analyze the data you're receiving, how does one know it's good idea, bad idea, or there's other nuances that might influence your thinking? Comments, sir?
That is an excellent point, Bob. And let me make 2 comments to that. Number one, I've done experiments like this where I actually asked ChatGPT to provide references. Okay, now I don't think they're going to be as specific and as targeted as the references you as an attorney would need. And secondly, this is a major issue that has to do with the fact that, and it touches on intellectual property, because therefore you don't know exactly what content, in a sense, was used to produce this output. Unlike Google, which, by the way, will at least has an authority algorithm that will largely return web pages in response to a query that, by its measure, are more authoritative. So these are very important issues, and I would suggest that from an, obviously you're the attorney, not me, but I think it's a good starting point. I think you suggested that sort of on the marriage agreement, the prenup or whatever, that indeed this is good guidance, but you still need to go back and very carefully check the outcome.
I'll give you an example, Rick, and that is, and obviously we're going to have to do multiple shows to get through all the materials you want to do today, but there are certain technologies you can use to do legal research. But I still, as a more experienced, shall I say, or older attorney, you can call it either way you want, we still have the hard copy red volume of the statutes and case laws in Connecticut, because sometimes I want to make sure that the key words, when I gave the example about the divorce situation, premarital agreement, I gave certain key words. And sometimes you want to have your own research. And the only point I'm making is nothing, Google, any kind of technology is a perfect answer. You've got to always do your own thing. And I think, Rick, wasn't there a case that came up where a lawyer did a brief based upon AI or Chat GPT, and the cases were made up? Do you know anything about that situation?
It's one of my favorite stories. Long story short, some guy flies from Honduras on a non-U.S. carrier to JFK. You know those large luggage carts in JFK. Well, it turns out the guy gets blindsided by one of those and is hurt in some way. So of course, he does what anybody injured in JFK does. That is, he calls a New York attorney. So, by the way, I should mention that ChatGPT scored in the 89th percentile of the LSAT score. So I will go out on a limb and say that the attorney in question here, you can Google his name, it's a common name, probably had an LSAT score seriously south of that. So he was feeling the pressure.
Yeah, I think seriously sounds an understatement.
Right. So at any rate, I mean, you know, the panic, you got a brief, the judge has asked for a brief the next day. You don't have a clue what you're doing, but this guy figured it out. I'm going to go to ChatGPT. And said, ChatGPT, hey, listen, you know, I'm in a world of hurt here. I need a 10-page brief by tomorrow. ChatGPT said, no problem, buddy. Here it is. So he gets it, and guess what? There's about 6 legal citations in it. And he looks at him and says, well, gee, I'm not sure this is right. So, by the way, rather than using all the informed sources that you as an experienced attorney would use, he decides to ask ChatGPT, well, is this a real reference? And ChatGPT comes back and says, listen, pal, I just gave it to you. Of course it's real. Well, guess what? It wasn't real. And guess what? When the opposing attorneys read this brief and tried to, you know, use LexisNexis or whatever you guys use, serious attorneys use, they immediately found out that these things were all false. And by the way, to me as a non-lawyer, these look like very reasonable citations. And long story short, the good news is that, I guess, for this guy, he didn't get disbarred. He did get sanctioned. But I like to use this as not only as a kind of a humorous story, but rather because it's an example of how ChatGPT, if it's operating in a space where there's relatively little insight, I don't know, like, you know, legal issues around luggage carts injuring people at JFK, it just says, well, no problem. I'm just going to fill in the gaps here with what I can do. And that's exactly what it did with these legal briefs.
Yeah, it sounds to me like, and I've been to went to a couple seminars given in the legal perspective about dealing with AI and ChatGPT. And by the way, under the canons of ethics that apply to all lawyers and judges, except for the Supreme Court judges, there are requirements to, and people know what I'm talking about if you follow politics now at all. People now, if you're a lawyer, you have to stay current with current technology. And so we can't, as lawyers, put our heads in the sand like an ostrich and say, well, you know what? I'll go back to the old ways. You have to use everything as a guideline, and you do have to keep up with technology. That's how I'm able to use Zoom and Microsoft Teams that I never knew before COVID. Rick, we've run out of time, which I knew we would, and I apologize because some of my questions led astray from where you intended to take us. But you know what? That's the fun of the Bobby O Show. In any event, we'll have you back to do more of the slides that you had presented for us and prepared for us to talk about developments in the AI world. Rick Lawrence, thank you very much. You're always a wonderful guest. That's why I keep calling you back. This has been Bob Opatzner on the Bobby O Show, relaxed and refreshed from being in Italy. Have a great day.
Take care, Bob. Good seeing you.